You arrived before sunrise that Thursday, the same way you had for nearly 2 decades. 18 years of unlocking that same door, 18 years of fixing problems before anyone noticed them, 18 years of carrying a department that ran smoother because your hands were steady and your judgment was seasoned. Most of the new faces had no idea that half the processes they used every day were shortcuts you created to protect them from drowning. You watched fresh graduates walk in with shiny badges and loud confidence, unaware that the spreadsheets they flaunted were built on codes you wrote during nights when everyone else was asleep. The office smelled of burnt coffee and new paint, a mix that always reminded you of how often the company tried to look younger instead of wiser. You placed your lunch in the fridge, greeted the receptionist who still respected you, and headed toward your desk. Everything looked normal, yet something in the air carried the wrong kind of silence. A few employees avoided eye contact. Others whispered. Then an HR assistant, barely in her 20s, approached you with an overly bright smile and asked you to come in early for a quick meeting. She said it lightly, but you felt the weight beneath her words. Inside the small HR room, every detail was rehearsed. The blinds were half closed, letting just enough light in to make the space feel sterile. 2 HR representatives waited at the table. The junior manager, the same one you trained 2 years earlier, leaned back in his chair as if he owned the place. They gestured for you to sit. Their smiles never reached their eyes. A folder sat in the center of the table, its edges sharp, like a paper knife waiting to cut something that had taken years to build. They spoke in measured tones about restructuring, aligning new directions, adjusting resources to fit future needs. You listened without blinking. Every sentence felt like a performance meant to sound compassionate while hiding the truth. Then the junior manager let his arrogance spill. He smirked and said you should step aside and let younger talent take the wheel, as if experience were a burden and not the backbone of everything that kept the company standing. The room fell quiet after his words. HR froze, realizing he had said what they tried so hard to disguise. You felt your chest tighten, but not from sadness. It was the sharp burn of insult, the kind that reaches deeper than anger. 18 years reduced to a line delivered by someone who still asked you for help with basic tasks last month. You looked at the folder, then at each of them, and realized they expected you to argue or break down or defend your relevance. They wanted a reaction so they could label you emotional or resistant to change. But you gave them nothing. You stood still, shoulders firm, eyes steady, letting silence sit heavier than anything they had rehearsed. You closed the folder without reading it and slid it back across the table. You told them there was no need for explanations. Their decision was clear. Their values were clearer. You stood up, thanked them for the opportunity to witness how a company treats the people who built its foundation, and walked out. No raised voice. No confrontation. No begging. You denied them the satisfaction of seeing any crack in your composure. The hallway felt longer than usual, but every step felt like reclaiming something they tried to take. On your way out, coworkers peeked from behind cubicle walls, eyes wide, unsure how to react. A few lowered their heads, ashamed. Others pretended to stay busy. You cleared your desk calmly, placed your badge on top of the monitor, and walked toward the exit with the same dignity you carried on your first day 18 years ago. The sun outside felt warmer than it had in months. By noon, your phone was silent. No calls, no messages. But inside the building you had just left, something had shifted. Minor confusion began to ripple through the department. A report refused to load. A daily automated process failed to run. A system message popped up in red on the junior manager's screen. He dismissed it, assuming it was a small glitch. He always dismissed problems he did not understand. He did not know that the system he bragged about was held together by invisible routines you updated manually each morning before anyone arrived. By 1 p.m., the customer database started returning errors. The team tried to restart it twice. It kept crashing. Someone mentioned your name in a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might admit something they did not want to face. You were the only one who knew how to reroute the backup server during heavy traffic hours. That knowledge had never been documented, because management always said they would schedule time to record procedures, and then never did. They trusted you to remember everything. Until they didn't. By 2 p.m., clients began calling angrily. The automated billing system froze. Password resets stopped working. The server logs filled with warnings the junior manager could not even interpret. People rushed through hallways. IT teams scrambled. Laptops rebooted over and over. Screens blinked with error codes. Someone suggested calling you, but the junior manager refused and insisted that his team could handle it. He underestimated the complexity of the work you had done for years because he believed youth equaled talent and age equaled limitation. At 2:40 p.m., the main dashboard that executives relied on to track operations went completely dark. Every metric vanished from the screen. A meeting was interrupted. Voices rose. The director demanded answers no one could give. The junior manager tried to improvise explanations, but each sentence dug him deeper into the truth he had been pretending did not exist. By 3 p.m., panic reached its peak. The entire system collapsed. Projects halted. Access froze. Employees stared helplessly at blank screens. The company that believed it could replace 18 years of mastery with a junior manager's confidence was now paralyzed by everything you kept running in quiet consistency. The silence you carried out of that HR room returned to them as chaos. Your absence, something they had treated as disposable, had become louder than any speech you could have made. They wanted younger talent to take the wheel. Instead, they watched the entire car stall in the middle of the highway. And not because you sabotaged anything. Because you had been the invisible engine they never bothered to understand. That Thursday morning, they thought they were closing a chapter. They didn't realize they were tearing out the pages that held their whole story together. And the day they fired you for being too old was the day they discovered who had been carrying their future all along. 2 hours after you walked out of the building, the silence you left behind began to echo louder than any confrontation could have. It started with a small alert on the junior manager's screen, a flashing notification that looked unimportant at first glance. He dismissed it and kept typing his weekly brag post for the company's internal forum. But the alert returned, more insistent this time, blinking like a final warning they were too arrogant to interpret. The main server, the one that handled every financial transaction, employee record, and client interface, was entering its first stage of failure. Log stalled mid-process. Automatic backups froze. The dashboard that monitored system health displayed a single red stripe across the top, something you had not seen once in your 18 years because you always corrected errors before sunrise. They had forgotten that your early mornings were not a habit. They were the reason the company functioned while managers slept. At 10:32 a.m., a report request from the finance department timed out. The analyst thought it was routine lag, so she tried again. It timed out again. She contacted the new IT lead, a young employee who still pronounced half the software tools incorrectly. He shrugged and said he would look into it. The finance analyst insisted it was urgent because the quarterly audit team was arriving in less than 2 days. The IT lead assured her everything was fine, but he sounded more confident than capable. At 11 a.m., the first wave of panic rippled through the office. The server went dark. The entire structure that managed workflows, schedules, and internal communication shut down. Employees stared at their screens, refreshing pages that returned nothing. The new IT lead tried to restart the server remotely and failed. He tried again and failed. He attempted to access the master controls but was denied because authorization keys timed out. He checked the documentation folder but found nothing useful. Every critical configuration was stored in your private knowledge bank, the one they never asked about until it was already too late. Your former manager rushed into the server room, tie crooked, sweat forming on his forehead. His confidence cracked. He spoke to the IT lead in rushed whispers. They attempted a manual override, but the system rejected every command. The recovery scripts you used for emergencies were not running because they had never bothered to learn where they were stored. At the time, you had asked repeatedly for them to assign someone to shadow you, someone to learn the structure you built step by step. They always said later. They always said you were too organized for problems to occur. They never imagined what the company looked like without you patching holes before the world saw them. At 11:27 a.m., the authorization keys you created for privileged access failed completely. No one knew the origin of the layered architecture you had designed to prevent data breaches. The new team believed it was outdated. They had planned on removing several layers next quarter to make the system look modern. But what they saw now was a labyrinth they could not navigate. Files vanished because the repository pointer you manually reset every morning had reached its limit. The company had grown, but the junior managers had not listened when you said the structure needed remodeling. By noon, The CEO himself sent a message to the IT department asking for a status summary. The IT lead, panicked, responded vaguely. Words like temporary, manageable, overload, and minor were thrown around like confetti designed to hide the truth. But the CEO was not a fool. He sensed disaster beneath the comfort. He called your former manager directly. The conversation was short and tense. You were mentioned. The manager insisted the system had nothing to do with your departure. He repeated that phrase even when no one asked. He repeated it because even he could hear the lie trembling. At 12:30 p.m., the company's largest client attempted to access the shared portal. They received an error message. They attempted again. Another error message. They contacted the account manager. She checked her dashboard and found it empty. She attempted to call support, but was redirected to voicemail because the phone system's internal routing depended on the server connection, which had already failed. The client tried to reach your manager's line, but calls dropped mid-signal. Inside the building, the atmosphere thickened. People whispered your name in fragmented sentences. Not because they blamed you, because they knew. You had warned them for years that shortcuts snap without notice. They had laughed at the idea of a crash. They believed technology maintained itself. They believed youth compensated for experience. But the building they stood in now felt fragile. The walls looked thinner. The hum of machines they took for granted faded into an ominous quiet. At 1 p.m., the first meeting to address the crisis began. The IT team gathered in a conference room with laptops open, trying every method they could remember. They entered passwords they barely understood. They clicked through interfaces you had customized years earlier. But the system rejected every attempt because it needed the master key. The key only you knew. Not because you hid it. Because they never cared to learn it. Your former manager asked whether they could reset the architecture manually. The IT lead said it was impossible without your sequence code. That sentence froze the entire room. They all knew what it meant. The security architecture you built was too advanced to replace with guesses. Every part of it was layered to prevent infiltration, designed to protect the company from internal mistakes as much as external threats. You had built it to last. You had not built it for amateurs. At 1:40 p.m., the audit team called, asking for access to preliminary reports. The finance department tried to stall. The audit team insisted. They wanted everything ready by morning. The finance analyst began to panic. The quarterly audit determined investor confidence. If the company failed to deliver complete data, consequences would be severe. At 2 p.m., senior management flooded the server room. Sleeves rolled. Voices raised. Instructions overlapped. The IT lead tried one final recovery script. The screen blinked. Lines of code appeared, then froze. Every eye in the room followed the progress bar. It stopped at 30% and vanished, replaced by a plain message that pulled the breath from every chest. Core system inaccessible. Authorization required. They stared at each other, trying not to say what they were all thinking. Then someone finally spoke. The sentence cut through the panic like a blade. How do you fire the only person who knows where the master key is buried? By 3 p.m., the perfect wall they had bragged about, the polished structure they said could run without you, stood cracked and collapsing. Chaos filled the hallways. Clients complained. Executives fumed. The junior manager who smirked that morning now sat pale, trembling, realizing that youth might bring energy, but experience keeps the lights on. And every second of disaster reminded them of a truth they never respected. You were not just an employee. You were the foundation they thought they could replace. The first call arrived at 3:07 p.m., just minutes after the internal crisis reached its peak. The receptionist, already overwhelmed by internal chaos, answered with a voice too thin to disguise her worry. A regional bank representative demanded to know why their authentication process had locked out every branch in the district. Their staff could not access customer profiles. Their remote clearance system had stalled mid-transfer. The bank insisted it was an emergency. The receptionist transferred the call to the operations floor, where no one was prepared to answer. Before the team could respond, a second call arrived, then a third, and a fourth. The pattern formed so quickly it became impossible to distinguish one crisis from another. A hospital IT administrator appeared next on the call list, reporting that patient records were inaccessible. Nurses could not retrieve medication charts. Doctors could not review histories. The hospital had trusted the company with its digital backbone because your structure had been rock solid for 10 years. It had never failed. Not once. until the day after they fired the only person who understood it. The logistics company followed soon after. Their shipments were frozen on the tracking system. Warehouses could not dispatch trucks. Drivers had no access to routing maps. The company's system displayed a single error: authentication rejected. By the time the logistics manager finished describing the fallout, 2 major clients had already escalated their complaints directly to executive-level contacts. The phone system, still partially dependent on server filters, began glitching under the load. Inside the building, every conference room filled with people pacing, shouting, covering their faces, or staring at screens as if waiting for a miracle. The high ceilings that once felt modern now amplified every word of anger. Employees who joined the company for the glamorous atmosphere now realized how fragile that sheen had been. The younger staff, who had once dismissed your slow explanations and detailed documentation requests as unnecessary, now felt the ground shake beneath them. They huddled together, whispering fears about layoffs, failures, and recriminations. On the operations floor, managers fought to maintain control. Some blamed the IT team. Others blamed the new infrastructure plan. A few blamed the junior manager who had smirked at your dismissal. He stood in a corner now, pale and trembling, wiping sweat from his palms. He had been hired as proof that youthful confidence could replace seasoned expertise. Now, he could not even answer a basic question about the system's architecture. The biggest contract of all, a multi-million-dollar partnership with an international corporation, was the one that truly broke the illusion. Their automated operations platform depended fully on the authentication grid you had maintained manually for years. When the system tried to update its access tokens, the entire grid collapsed because the reset key expired that morning. It was the same key you had warned them about at least 6 times. Each time, the conversation was dismissed. They preferred to invest in redecorating the lobby rather than securing the architecture. When their operations froze, the corporation activated its emergency contact protocol. Their executives called your company's CEO directly. That call lasted only 3 minutes, but its aftershocks rippled through every department. Losses were mounting by the minute. Every second of downtime cost tens of thousands. The corporation demanded immediate resolution. The CEO promised it, but his voice, normally sharp and commanding, cracked under pressure. He looked around the room and saw panic instead of solutions. The board requested updates. The CEO called the directors into an emergency meeting, trying to control the narrative before they heard it from clients. But there was nothing to sweeten. The truth was a bitter mix of arrogance and oversight. He repeated the same sentence to them, trying to sound confident yet clinging to the words as if repeating them could make them true. We removed him because he was not aligned with our modern direction. The directors stared at him, some confused, others angry. One of them finally asked what modern direction meant if the company could not keep a single client online. The CEO insisted modernization required new talent, new energy. A different director asked why new talent had not produced new solutions. He had no answer. He kept repeating the same line, trying to hide the decision he had made with such pride that morning. On the operations floor, the domino effect continued. More clients reported failures. The automated billing system for an energy provider stopped processing payments. Their call center was flooded with angry customers demanding explanations. A transportation company reported that their fleet management platform went offline. Drivers had to navigate blind, guessing routes by memory. The transportation manager threatened to terminate the contract if the system was not restored within the hour. Meanwhile, employees whose roles were tied to day-to-day client support panicked. They watched their screens flicker in and out. They saw tasks disappear mid-process. They saw data entries freeze half-loaded. Some cried quietly at their desks. Others paced the hallways, clutching their phones as if expecting someone older, wiser, or calmer to arrive and save them. The irony was sharp. The person they needed most was the same person they had escorted out with polite smiles 2 hours earlier. In the conference rooms, meetings transformed into battlegrounds. Managers interrupted each other. Senior staff questioned every decision that had been made over the past month. Blame moved like wildfire, jumping from one department to another. The IT lead insisted he could fix the system, but his hands shook too much to type. The finance manager accused the development team of hiding flaws. The development team accused leadership of ignoring warnings. The CEO attempted to calm everyone, but his voice was drowned out by the rising storm. At 4 p.m., the board members concluded their emergency meeting with a directive. The crisis had to be contained. Every available resource needed to be mobilized. The CEO was instructed to contact external specialists. He called 3 consulting firms. All of them asked the same question before discussing fees. Who designed the original architecture? The CEO hesitated. He explained you were no longer with the company. The first firm declined immediately. The second asked how long ago you left. When he answered, the line went quiet for a second too long. Then they quoted a price triple the usual rate. The third firm refused outright, stating they could not reconstruct a custom system without its original designer. By 5 p.m., clients threatened legal action. The company's legal team assembled in yet another conference room, drafting replies that offered reassurance without admitting fault. But fault hung in the air, undeniable and suffocating. Every hallway carried the same whispered sentence. Why did they fire him? The IT team attempted one last recovery operation. The screen displayed a cascade of errors. Each line was more incomprehensible than the last. Someone suggested reaching out to you informally. The junior manager objected, insisting it would make leadership appear weak. The operations director ignored him and made a quiet note to herself. Meanwhile, the CEO repeated his line yet again to a director demanding answers. We removed him because he was not aligned with our modern direction. But the modern direction, everyone now realized, was a glossy phrase built on nothing. A phrase that sounded good in meetings but collapsed when placed against the weight of reality. A phrase that did not keep servers running, or clients satisfied, or contracts intact. The modern direction, in truth, had driven the company straight into a wall, and the brakes had been removed the moment they let you walk out the door. By late afternoon, something shifted inside the building you had once kept standing with nothing more than discipline, experience, and quiet consistency. The frantic energy that had filled the halls throughout the morning slowly transformed into something heavier. Panic had been loud and chaotic, but desperation was quieter. It seeped into the corners of every department, settling into the breath of every executive who finally understood the magnitude of the mistake they had made. They had dismissed the one person who understood the system down to its bones, the only person who could see beyond the surface and into the architecture that held all their operations together. And they had done it with a smile, a prepared script, and a phrase about modernization that now sounded like the beginning of their downfall. Around 4 p.m., the executives gathered around a long glass table in the boardroom. The room that once hosted confident presentations and polished quarterly reports now felt like a place of reckoning. The large screen at the front displayed a frozen login page. Beneath it sat a spreadsheet of error logs that none of them understood. The IT lead stood at the head of the table, exhausted, sweating through his shirt, voice trembling each time the CEO asked for a status update. Every answer he gave was worse than the last. He tried to explain that the documentation for the core system was incomplete. He explained that the manual resets required a key that no one had. He explained that the architecture was layered in a way he had never seen before because it had been built carefully over many years, adjustments made quietly before anyone else arrived in the morning. He explained, finally, that only one person had the full blueprint. The same person they had escorted out earlier that day. The room went silent. Executives exchanged uneasy glances, each of them replaying the events of the morning in their minds. They had believed removing you would be a clean break. They had believed the younger team would fill the gap. They had believed the system would run itself, because that had always been the illusion you made possible. But illusions collapse when the hands holding them steady disappear. A director spoke first, voice trembling slightly as she pointed out the obvious. If the documentation was incomplete, then the company was essentially blind. The system was a machine with its engine locked from within. The CEO tried to remain composed, insisting the team had enough talent to reconstruct the missing pieces. But the IT lead shook his head. He knew the truth, and now he had to say it out loud. Without the master blueprint, they could spend weeks trying to reverse engineer the architecture. And even then, they might never reach full stability again. The layers you had built were not improvised. They were crafted with precision after years of experience, shaped by problems you had solved before anyone else arrived to notice them. The CEO sank back into his chair, eyes blank. He knew the contracts at risk. He knew the financial impact of losing even a single major client. He knew the board would demand an explanation. And he now knew the decision he had made so confidently only hours earlier was unraveling faster than the company's reputation could withstand. At 4:30 p.m., the first executive broke the unspoken rule. She suggested contacting you. The junior manager immediately objected, but his voice cracked. It was clear to everyone that he was more afraid of being exposed than he was concerned about company pride. Another director countered him sharply, reminding him that his ego had already cost them enough. The CEO nodded slowly, realizing there was no other option. He instructed the HR representative to reach out to you. She stepped out of the room, clutching her phone with trembling hands. Her first message was formal, polite, and stiff. She apologized for the morning meeting. She acknowledged that the systems were experiencing difficulties. She asked whether you might be available for a brief consultation. When you did not respond, she waited a few minutes, then sent a second message with a completely different tone. This one was longer, filled with worry and urgency. She explained that everything was failing. She begged you to help them, framing it as a request for your expertise and empathy. She ended the message with a sentence she would have never imagined writing that morning. "We need you." She returned to the boardroom with no reply. The CEO instructed another department head to email you. His message was strategic, an attempt to appeal to your pride. He wrote about the respect the company had for your legacy, about the value of your contributions, about the importance of your knowledge. But the words felt hollow, even to him. He knew they had insulted you. He knew they had dismissed everything you had built. And now he knew you had no reason to help them. When that email went unanswered, the CEO sent a text message himself. He kept it short, hoping urgency would reach you faster than flattery. He explained that the company was facing a severe crisis. He said he understood that today's events had been difficult. He added that he was willing to compensate you generously for your time. He checked his phone repeatedly, waiting for the typing indicator to appear. It never did. Around 5 p.m., another director attempted to call you. The line rang. There was no answer. She tried again. This time, the call went straight to voicemail. She left a message explaining that clients were threatening legal action. She said the company was collapsing. She said the system you built was too advanced for them to manage. Her voice cracked halfway through. She thanked you for everything you had done over the years, her words soft and full of regret. But you did not pick up. As the sun began to set, desperation settled into the building like fog. Employees whispered at their desks, watching executives move with urgency they had never seen before. Some younger workers cried quietly, convinced they were about to lose their jobs. Others sent frantic messages to friends or partners, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The junior manager who had smirked only hours earlier now sat in an empty office with his head in his hands, realizing his arrogance had played a part in the crisis unfolding around him. The HR representative tried one last time. She wrote a long message, not formal, not polished, not rehearsed. She admitted the decision to fire you had been wrong. She admitted she had felt uncomfortable during the meeting. She admitted that she regretted not speaking up. She asked for forgiveness she knew she did not deserve. She asked for help she had no right to expect. You read the messages. You saw the missed calls. You saw the desperation. And you chose silence. Not because you wanted revenge. Not because you wanted them to suffer. Because sometimes silence carries more weight than a lecture. Silence is a boundary. Silence is the moment when a person finally realizes that respect cannot be demanded retroactively. They had dismissed you as outdated. They had called you misaligned. They had pushed you out without hesitation. Now they understood the cost of that choice. And you understood something too. You had spent years carrying a company that never learned to walk on its own. Today, you finally let go. Silence, in the end, taught them the lesson they had refused to learn. By early evening, the storm inside the company had spread far beyond its walls. What started as internal panic transformed into a public disaster that no press release, no carefully crafted statement, no emergency meeting could contain. The company had always prided itself on its sleek image, its modern branding, its spotless reputation for reliability. But reputations built on illusions crumble quickly when the truth hits daylight. And on this particular evening, the truth wasn't knocking politely. It was breaking the door down. The first public crack came from a frustrated client who managed a regional logistics network. His operations had been frozen for hours, costing him thousands by the minute. He posted an angry message on social media, tagging the company and accusing them of catastrophic negligence. His post gained traction almost instantly. Drivers quoted it. Warehouse supervisors commented under it. Other logistics managers shared it, adding their own stories of halted work and unreachable support lines. The company's social media team attempted to reply with generic apologies, but their responses were drowned beneath a rising flood of criticism. Minutes later, a second blow landed. A hospital administrator, furious about the disruption to patient records, released a public statement. She didn't name the company directly, but she didn't have to. Anyone familiar with the region knew which firm handled the hospital's systems. Her tone was calm but sharp, mentioning delays in medical processing, concerns for patient safety, and an urgent need for answers. Her words carried weight. Healthcare failures are not taken lightly, and journalists noticed immediately. By 6 p.m., technology reporters from 2 major outlets had begun contacting the company for comments. Their emails arrived in clusters, each more persistent than the last. But the communications department had nothing to say. They weren't receiving updates from the inside. They weren't even sure who was in charge of crisis management. They drafted a short response claiming the company was experiencing technical difficulties, but the phrasing felt empty, almost embarrassed, as if they knew the world wasn't going to accept such a vague explanation for such a massive collapse. The real explosion happened when a financial news account posted a thread summarizing the entire situation based on whispers from employees and screenshots from frustrated clients. The thread went viral. It mentioned server failures, authentication crashes, halted operations, multi-million-dollar disruptions, and internal chaos. People shared it, dissected it, mocked the company's claims of modernization, and criticized its leadership. The narrative shifted from inconvenience to corporate incompetence. Within the hour, investors began reacting. The company's stock did something it hadn't done in years. It dipped. Not slightly. Significantly. It was the kind of drop that signals more than a temporary glitch. It signaled distrust. And distrust spreads faster than any system failure. Inside the boardroom, panic reached a level the walls had never witnessed. The CEO sat stiffly, staring at a live stock chart, as if willing it to reverse through sheer force of denial. The CFO paced the room, phone glued to his ear, speaking in a tone so tight it barely sounded like speech. 2 board members argued quietly in the corner about whether they should release a public apology or wait until the morning. The director responsible for client relations had tears in her eyes, reading through an avalanche of messages from partners threatening to withdraw contracts. At 7 p.m., the board gathered around the large screen displaying social media feeds. The CFO read the most damaging comments aloud. A hospital warning about digital instability. A logistics company posting photos of trucks stuck at loading docks. A bank leaking information about authentication disruptions. Every post was a blow to their credibility. Every share multiplied the impact. Every minute of silence from the company made it worse. Inside a private management group chat, heated messages piled up faster than anyone could read them. Leaders argued about where the root cause lay. Some blamed rushed modernization. Some blamed careless delegation. Others blamed the arrogant assumption that experience could be replaced by enthusiasm alone. Then one manager wrote a sentence that stopped the argument cold. We underestimated him. For a moment, the group chat quieted. It was the first honest admission anyone had made all day. But honesty alone does not repair a collapsing structure. The CFO replied, his message appearing as a stark block of text beneath the admission. No, we disrespected him. That line hit the group like a punch. It cut through every justification, every excuse, every attempt to paint the decision in polite corporate language. They had not underestimated you. Underestimation implies ignorance. But they had known your value. They had seen your consistency. They had relied on your work without ever acknowledging it. They had taken your quiet efficiency for granted. They had dismissed your warnings. They had mocked your experience. They had called you outdated. They had disrespected you. And now they were watching the consequences unfold in real time. Outside the boardroom, employees gathered in small clusters, whispering about what they saw online. Screens displayed article headlines growing bolder by the hour. System outage causes massive disruption. Major clients report failures after internal collapse. Tech firm faces scrutiny amid widespread crash. Younger workers felt fear settle into their stomachs as they imagined layoffs, restructuring, and instability. Older workers shook their heads in disbelief, seeing a lesson written clearly in the wreckage. Experience is not a burden. It is a shield. And the company had shattered its own shield willingly. By 8 p.m., journalists began calling former employees. Some of them had heard you were let go that morning. They wanted to confirm whether the rumors were true. They wanted to know whether the collapse was connected to your departure. They wanted to know why someone with 18 years of expertise had been dismissed hours before the company imploded. Reporters sensed the irony. They sensed a story big enough to headline. And they wouldn't let it go. Board members started sending private messages to the CEO, questioning his leadership. Some demanded an emergency press conference. Others insisted he resign. The CFO attempted to calm them, but his efforts fell flat. The board understood something fundamental. A multi-million-dollar company should never collapse in a single afternoon because of one person's absence. But they also understood something deeper. It was not your absence that caused the collapse. It was their arrogance, their disrespect, their inability to recognize the weight of experience until it was gone. By late evening, the company was trending for all the wrong reasons. Memes circulated. Investors grew nervous. Clients threatened lawsuits. And still, no one had heard back from you. You spent the evening quietly, phone silent, messages unread. You watched the sky turn dark outside your window, feeling no need to intervene. Not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, simply because the lesson was teaching itself. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response. And sometimes public shame is the only language arrogance understands. While chaos swallowed the company you had carried for nearly 2 decades, your world looked surprisingly calm. You sat by the window of a small cafe downtown, a place you used to visit only on weekends because work always demanded your mornings. The cup of coffee in front of you was warm, comforting, and strangely symbolic. For the first time in years, you were tasting the day at your own pace. No rushing to fix someone else's oversight. No sprinting into the office before sunrise to prevent a dozen future crises. No carrying the weight of a building that pretended you were invisible. Your phone buzzed lightly on the table, not with desperate messages from your former employer, but with something entirely different. Opportunities. Real ones. Messages from companies that had tried to recruit you for years, but had always stepped back out of respect for your loyalty. Some were polite invitations. Others were almost pleading. A few had sent messages earlier in the afternoon after hearing rumors about a surprising departure. Word traveled quickly in your industry. Good professionals are noticed. Great ones are watched. But the rare few who keep entire infrastructures breathing without asking for applause are valued far beyond their titles. For years, you had turned down every offer. You believed in commitment. You believed in building something meaningful. You believed loyalty was a principle, not a commodity. But sitting at that cafe now, with sunlight reflecting off your cup and freedom settling into your shoulders, you saw your past with new clarity. Loyalty without respect is not loyalty at all. It is self-betrayal disguised as dedication. And you realized you had been betraying yourself quietly for years without noticing the slow erosion of your worth. One message caught your attention more than the others. It came from a small company, a rising organization still growing, still learning, still hungry for direction. The subject line was simple but striking. We want your vision. You opened it, expecting another rehearsed corporate pitch. But the message inside felt genuine. It acknowledged your experience. It admired the work you had done. It didn't ask what you could fix for them. It asked what you wanted to build. It didn't ask whether you were up to date with the newest trends. It asked which trends you believed were worth following. It didn't mention age. It didn't mention modernization. It didn't hide behind buzzwords. Instead, the CEO wrote openly about wanting a foundation strong enough to survive a decade of growth. He wrote that he believed experience wasn't a limitation, but the most valuable resource in the industry. He asked you what kind of system you would design if you were given the freedom to start from scratch. He asked about your approach to leadership, not your ability to adapt to someone else's shortcuts. He asked what kind of company the future needed, not what kind of company could impress investors with buzzwords about youth and trends. You leaned back in your chair, rereading the message slowly. You felt a quiet stirring inside you, something you had not felt in years. Confidence. Not the loud, performative kind that younger managers wore like perfume. The steady kind that comes from knowing you have survived storms that others only read about. The kind that comes from solving problems before people even recognize them as threats. The kind that comes from carrying knowledge earned the hard way. You replied, not with desperation or haste, but with thoughtfulness. You asked about their long-term vision. You asked about their culture. You asked whether they valued process or chaos. You asked how they treated their oldest employees. You asked whether they built systems to grow or systems to impress. Your message was honest, firm, and free. You no longer needed to convince anyone of your worth. Either they saw it or they didn't. And if they didn't, you would not waste another minute teaching them how to respect what they had already overlooked. Their response arrived minutes later. It was even better than you expected. They wanted to meet that same evening. Not to pressure you, but because they believed your insight could guide the entire direction of their company. They weren't rushing. They were eager. There is a difference between desperation and recognition. And this was recognition. You closed your eyes for a moment and allowed the feeling to settle in. Relief. Validation. Gratitude. Not gratitude for losing your old job, but gratitude for being freed from a place that had quietly drained your passion. Gratitude that the universe sometimes clears out rooms you didn't realize you were trapped in. Gratitude that the collapse of one building could reveal the open doors of another. Hours earlier, the executives who dismissed you had looked at your age and seen limitation. They had mistaken calm confidence for stagnation. They had mistaken quiet mastery for irrelevance. They had believed loud enthusiasm could replace silent expertise. They had believed youth was innovation and age was obstruction. But this new company didn't see your age at all. They saw the years of resilience behind your voice. They saw the way your career had weathered shifts in technology long before half the industry leaders were even out of school. They saw the value in stability. They saw the golden thread that age weaves into experience. In that moment, a profound realization settled into you with the tenderness of truth. You were never outdated. You were experienced. And experience is gold, just not in a place that worships youth over wisdom. You finished your coffee, stood up, and walked out of the cafe with a new pace in your step. The city lights flickered on. The breeze felt different now, lighter, carrying none of the tension you used to bring home after long nights of fixing crises created by others. You weren't rushing to rescue a company that never thanked you. You weren't bracing for another email filled with blame disguised as feedback. You weren't preparing yourself for another cycle of invisible labor. You were stepping toward a new chapter, one where people asked for your vision, not your compliance. One where you didn't need to shrink your experience to make others comfortable. One where you didn't have to pretend you were less knowledgeable just to fit into someone else's illusion of modernity. One where you could build again, not patch what others broke. That night, when you met with the new team, something sparked inside you. Their curiosity, their respect, their willingness to listen, their belief that experience shapes progress more than any trend ever could. They didn't look at you and see years. They looked at you and saw decades of wisdom. You answered their questions calmly, guiding them through ideas and possibilities they hadn't considered. And as you spoke, you felt something you had almost forgotten. Excitement, purpose, the quiet joy of being valued. By the time the meeting ended, they made an offer. Not just a job, a role shaped around your strengths. A seat at the table where decisions were made, not where blame was assigned. A chance to build something lasting, something meaningful, something that honored the years you carried. You accepted, not because you needed redemption, but because you finally remembered your worth. And while your former company drowned in the consequences of their own arrogance, you stepped into the beginning of a future they had been too blind to imagine. A week later, the dust settled enough for the world to see the damage clearly. The company you had once protected like a second home finally broke its silence. They released a public statement dense with corporate jargon, the kind meant to sound polished while saying nothing at all. They blamed unexpected technical difficulties. They mentioned unforeseeable disruptions. They implied that the entire crisis was some spontaneous digital storm rather than the predictable outcome of firing the only person who understood their core system. But the world was not fooled. Clients had already connected the dots. Employees had already leaked screenshots. Journalists had already published full timelines. The truth had traveled faster than any carefully edited press release could catch up with. The statement landed with a thud, ignored by those who knew better and mocked by those who had watched the chaos unfold in real time. The company's attempt to rewrite history failed because too many witnesses still remembered the smoke rising from the wreckage. While their PR team struggled to soften the blow, the consequences kept spreading. 2 major contracts, both multi-million-dollar agreements, were terminated within days. One client cited a breach of trust so severe that no amount of repair could salvage the relationship. Another simply stated that they could not risk their future on a partner who allowed a system collapse of that magnitude. Losing those contracts shook the company to its core. Those accounts had funded entire departments. Their departure created holes that no quick fix or inspirational meeting could fill. Inside the office, the atmosphere had changed from frantic to resigned. Managers who once walked with stiff shoulders and loud confidence now moved quietly, avoiding eye contact with their teams. Several of them submitted resignations before the week ended. Some left out of guilt. Others fled to protect their own reputations before the board started pointing fingers. A few realized that staying would mean carrying responsibility for decisions they never agreed with but were too afraid to challenge. Each resignation chipped away at the facade of stability the CEO desperately tried to maintain. Employees whispered about the internal investigations. Rumors spread that the board was examining every strategic decision made over the past year. They questioned why modernization had become a buzzword rather than a plan. They questioned why the company's most experienced staff had been pushed aside for the sake of appearances. They questioned why warnings had been dismissed. They questioned why leadership had chosen ego over experience. Eventually, those questions circled back to the CEO's door. The board met behind closed doors. Discussions grew tense. The CFO reported the financial losses in a voice stripped of emotion. The director responsible for investor relations revealed that calls were pouring in from shareholders demanding accountability. The head of client relations admitted that trust was collapsing faster than they could rebuild it. The CEO attempted to defend his decisions, framing them as necessary changes for growth. But his words rang hollow against the glaring reality of the damage. Growth had not happened. Collapse had. The board did not need to name the reason. Everyone knew. It was not the system failure alone. It was not the public embarrassment. It was not even the loss of contracts. It was the arrogance that had guided those choices. Decisions made to impress instead of protect. Choices built on image instead of substance. Leadership that valued appearance over expertise. The kind of thinking that believes experience becomes irrelevant just because youth is louder. Outside the company, the industry murmured. Tech executives spoke quietly over dinners. Managers exchanged stories at conferences. Recruiters shared warnings in private forums. Everyone knew the story, and everyone repeated the same sentence with a tone that mixed disbelief, amusement, and a hint of pity. That company fired the wrong person. It became an industry cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when leadership prioritizes trend over talent. People spoke about you with respect, even admiration, though many had never met you. They saw you not as the reason the company failed, but as the proof of everything the company had neglected. Those who had dismissed experience started to rethink their hiring practices. Those who valued wisdom felt validated. Those who had been passed over for younger candidates felt the story resonate deeply, like a quiet vindication. Meanwhile, the CEO found himself facing the consequences of decisions he had once celebrated as bold steps forward. The rumors grew louder each day. Board members whispered among themselves about restructuring at the highest level. Some wanted immediate change. Others sought to delay action until the media storm faded. But all of them agreed on one thing. Leadership had failed. Not because of a lack of modern direction. Not because of unexpected challenges. But because of arrogance disguised as innovation. Inside the hallways you once walked, people spoke your name differently now. Not as an afterthought. Not as a relic of the past. But as the person whose absence exposed everything the company had hidden for years. They remembered your patience. They remembered your warnings. They remembered the mornings you arrived before everyone else. They remembered how crises never made it past sunrise because you solved them before the world woke up. Only now did they realize how rare that kind of reliability was, and how foolish it had been to discard it. As the days passed, the company's reputation continued to erode. More articles appeared. More clients questioned their partnerships. More investors demanded answers. The CEO's hold on his position grew weaker. Some insiders claimed a vote was approaching. Others believed the board had already decided but was waiting for the right moment. Everyone knew the truth, even if no one said it aloud. The company wasn't collapsing because one employee left. It was collapsing because leadership had undermined the very foundation that kept it stable. And at the center of the conversation was the same quiet truth the industry kept repeating. They fired the wrong person. You watched all of this unfold from a distance, without bitterness, without gloating, without the desire to prove anything to anyone. Karma does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in silently, hands full of consequences, and places them gently at the feet of those who earned them. A week earlier, they believed letting you go would modernize their company. Now they understood modernity means nothing without stability. Now they understood that wisdom is not obsolete. Now they understood that experience is not replaceable. And they understood all of it too late. Your story did not end inside that collapsing company. It grew beyond it, carried quietly through conversations, whispered in meetings, shared in forums, repeated in break rooms by people who finally saw themselves reflected in what happened to you. Not as victims, but as reminders, as proof, as a warning and a lesson intertwined. Your experience became a message for every person over 35 who wondered if the world had decided they were past their peak. The truth of what happened did not shout. It did not demand attention. It settled slowly, like a sunrise, revealing what had always been there. You did not sabotage anything. You did not take revenge. You did not manipulate the situation. You did not send threatening emails or leak information or attempt to humiliate anyone. You simply stepped back. You stepped out of a building that had forgotten its own foundation. And when your hands were no longer holding up the weight they pretended didn't exist, the structure collapsed under the truth they had denied. You had told them for years that systems built on shortcuts will eventually break. You did not need to force that lesson. Reality taught it for you. The people who watched the company crumble learned something the younger generation often forgets. Experience does not age. It deepens. It sharpens. It becomes wisdom. And while technology evolves quickly, understanding does not vanish just because someone celebrates a birthday. There is no expiration date on knowledge earned through years of trial, error, resilience, and adaptation. You had lived long enough to see systems born, grow, mutate, and fail. Your hands carried the history behind every update. Your mind held the memory of every near disaster avoided. That kind of knowledge cannot be downloaded. It cannot be replaced. It cannot be imitated by enthusiasm alone. You became the quiet reminder that value does not expire. Your competence did not shrink because younger coworkers used newer slang. Your worth did not diminish because a junior manager believed confidence was a substitute for wisdom. They treated your experience as if it were a relic, not realizing that relics are the things civilizations are built on. And when they discarded it, when they dismissed you with polite phrases and artificial smiles, they taught themselves a lesson they will remember far longer than they expected. In every industry, there are people who worship speed over understanding, chaos over structure, noise over clarity. They believe modernity means new for the sake of new, change for the sake of change, youth for the sake of image. They forget that innovation without direction becomes destruction, and direction comes from people who have lived long enough to recognize patterns. Your story exposed this truth without you saying a single word. Once you walked away, your life changed in ways you had not anticipated. You moved into a job where your voice mattered, where meetings paused when you spoke, where leadership asked for your perspective before finalizing decisions, where people understood that building something meaningful requires the guidance of those who have weathered storms. Your new workplace did not see your age as a flaw. They saw your years as your greatest strength. They understood that someone who has seen enough failures knows how to prevent new ones. They valued your calm, your clarity, your steady presence in moments of uncertainty. They welcomed the wisdom you carried, not as decoration, but as necessity. You found peace in the simple truth that your career was not defined by the short-sightedness of people who never understood your contribution. You discovered that your value is not determined by the company that let you go. It is determined by the company that fought to bring you in. And in your new role, you rediscovered something you had forgotten: the joy of being respected, the satisfaction of being heard, the comfort of working in a place that recognizes strength instead of age. Meanwhile, the company you left managed to restore their systems after weeks of scrambling, consulting, patching, reversing, rebuilding, and begging for help they once mocked. But even when the screens lit up again, even when the servers stabilized, even when the workflow resumed, something remained broken. Their credibility, their reputation, their sense of unquestioned authority. They had exposed themselves, not as innovators, but as amateurs disguised in glossy branding. Clients remembered the collapse. Investors remembered the panic. The public remembered the headlines. And the industry remembered the lesson. They lost something far more important than contracts. They lost trust. Trust does not reboot. Trust does not update automatically. Trust does not respond to patches or emergency fixes. Once it cracks, it leaves a mark that never fully disappears. Their systems recovered eventually. Their credibility never did. For people over 35, your experience whispered a message that felt like a breath of relief. It reminded them that age is not an obstacle. It is an advantage. It reminded them that the world may overlook them temporarily, but it cannot function without them permanently. It reminded them that walking away from disrespect is not failure. It is wisdom. That dignity is worth more than loyalty to the wrong place. That sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is to let a collapsing structure fall without trying to hold it up again. Your story became a lighthouse for anyone who wondered whether they still belonged in an industry obsessed with speed. It told them that value is not measured in youth, but in depth. It told them that experience is not outdated, but irreplaceable. It told them that anyone who treats your knowledge as disposable will eventually learn the cost of losing it. You moved forward quietly, carrying the strength of someone who has nothing left to prove. The collapse behind you was not your legacy. It was theirs. Your legacy is the future you stepped into. A future where respect is not requested, but earned. A future where your wisdom shapes direction instead of being filtered out of it. A future where your age is not hidden, but honored. And for everyone over 35, your journey became more than a story. It became proof. It became reassurance. It became truth. Experience doesn't age. Value doesn't expire. And wisdom never loses relevance.